War does not always begin with gunfire. Sometimes it begins with a purchase order. Sometimes history changes not on a battlefield, but in a quiet boardroom where desperation outweighs logic and fear silences doubt. In the late 1930s, as the world stood on the edge of its most destructive conflict, Imperial Japan made a decision that would echo through aviation history as one of its greatest miscalculations. It was not a decision made out of arrogance nor ignorance, but out of urgency. Japan needed a heavy bomber, something it had never successfully built before, and time was running out. So instead of developing one from scratch, Japan looked across the Pacific and found an answer that seemed convenient, affordable, and fast. It bought an American aircraft that America itself had already rejected. The airplane Japan purchased was not a weapon. It was not designed to fly through flak or survive fighter interception. It was never meant to carry bombs, guns, or armored crews into hostile skies. It was a civilian airliner, quietly discarded by the American aviation industry after failing to meet commercial expectations. In peacetime, this aircraft was considered inefficient and impractical. In wartime, Japan believed it could be transformed into something powerful. That belief would prove disastrous. Black and white photos of early American passenger aircraft, engineers inspecting fuselages. At the heart of this story lies a dangerous assumption that range alone could substitute for strength. Japanese military planners were obsessed with distance. The Pacific was vast, unforgiving, and strategically brutal. Any future war would require aircraft capable of flying farther than anything Japan had ever built. American bombers could already cross oceans. British aircraft were evolving rapidly. Japan, meanwhile, had mastered light fighters but struggled with large airframes. Heavy bombers demanded structural integrity, powerful engines, redundancy, and production discipline, areas where Japan's industry was still fragile. Yet instead of slowing down and building experience, Japan chose a shortcut, and shortcuts in war often lead straight to graves. Map animation showing distances across the Pacific, fading into factory scenes. The airplane Japan purchased had impressive range on paper, but paper is forgiving. Reality is not. The aircraft lacked reinforced wings, had no bomb bay, and was never tested for combat stress. Its engines were designed for steady cruising, not the brutal demands of overloaded takeoffs and combat climbs. Still, to Japanese eyes, it represented something irresistible, a head start, a foundation, a way to skip years of research and development. What Japan failed to understand, or chose to ignore, was that civilian aircraft succeed by entirely different rules than military bombers. In civilian aviation, efficiency matters more than survivability. In war, the opposite is true. Close-up of technical blueprints dissolving into military schematics. As engineers began modifying the aircraft, problems appeared almost immediately. Bomb racks added weight, gun turrets shifted balance, fuel tanks expanded stress loads. Every solution created two new problems. The aircraft grew heavier, but not stronger. Engines were pushed beyond safe limits. Structural fatigue increased with every flight. Pilots reported that the aircraft felt tired even when new, as if the design itself was resisting its new role. Yet production continued. There was no time to stop. The war in China was already consuming resources, and future conflicts loomed larger by the day. Japan could not afford to admit failure. Montage of mechanics working under pressure, sweat-stained uniforms, shaking engine tests. This bomber was supposed to symbolize Japan's technological leap forward. Instead, it exposed the cracks beneath the surface. Unlike America, which rejected designs that failed and moved on, Japan committed itself fully to a flawed foundation. Factories were retooled, crews were trained, doctrine was written around an aircraft that was never truly ready, and once war began, there would be no going back. The bomber would fly whether it worked or not. The men assigned to it would trust it, whether it deserved trust or not. War does not pause for second chances. Slow-motion footage of crews boarding aircraft, faces tense, engines starting. What makes this story especially tragic is that the failure was not dramatic at first. There were no spectacular explosions, no famous last stands. Instead, there were quiet warnings, abortive missions, mechanical failures, aircraft turning back before reaching targets, maintenance crews working overtime to keep airframes operational, pilots learning, often too late, that their aircraft could not protect them. These early signs were dismissed as growing pains, but they were symptoms of a deeper disease, a bomber born from compromise. By the time Japan entered full-scale war against the Allies, this bomber was already outdated. Faster fighters could catch it with ease. Anti-aircraft fire shredded its unprotected structure. Its defensive guns were insufficient, its ceiling too low, its speed too slow. Worst of all, it could not absorb damage. A single hit could be fatal. Crews knew this. Morale suffered. Missions felt less like operations and more like gambles. And yet, the aircraft kept flying, not because it was effective, but because Japan had nothing else to replace it. This is not the story of a villainous machine or incompetent engineers. It is the story of pressure, of decisions made when failure seems more dangerous than risk. Japan did not build history's worst heavy bomber because it lacked intelligence. It built it because it tried to force an answer before the question was fully understood. It mistook distance for dominance and adaptation for mastery. The bomber would never achieve the impact Japan hoped for. Instead, it would drain resources, endanger crews, and quietly fade into obscurity, overshadowed by the far more capable aircraft fielded by its enemies. And yet, this aircraft matters, because it reveals a truth that repeats itself throughout history. War punishes imitation, it punishes haste, and it shows no mercy to designs born from fear rather than understanding. Japan bought America's rejected airliner, believing it could outsmart time itself. What it learned instead was far harsher, that in war, shortcuts don't save lives, they cost them. And this was only the beginning of the story. To understand why Japan would ever consider turning a rejected American airliner into a heavy bomber, you have to understand the pressure Japan was under long before the first bombs of World War II fell on the Pacific. By the early 1930s, Japan was already fighting a war it could not easily win. The invasion of Manchuria in 1931 and the full-scale war in China after 1937 stretched Japanese resources thin. Supply lines grew longer, resistance grew stronger, and the idea of a quick victory quietly died. Japanese military planners began to realize that future wars would not be short campaigns fought near home. They would be wars of distance, endurance, and industrial output, areas where Japan was dangerously vulnerable. Geography was both Japan's greatest strength and its greatest weakness. As an island nation, Japan depended on control of sea lanes and long-range reach. Any conflict with Western powers, especially the United States, would unfold across thousands of kilometers of ocean. This reality made air power essential. Fighters could defend airspace and escort fleets, but bombers were the true instruments of strategic pressure. Bombers could strike ports, factories, airfields, and supply hubs far beyond the reach of naval guns. Japan wanted an aircraft that could do what American and British bombers were beginning to demonstrate: project power deep into enemy territory. But ambition alone does not create capability. Japan's aviation industry in the 1930s was still developing. While Japanese engineers were brilliant at extracting maximum performance from lightweight designs, they struggled with scale. Most Japanese aircraft factories were optimized for small to medium airframes. Large bombers required different tooling, different materials, and different tolerances. Heavy bombers also demanded engines that could produce sustained high power without failure. Japanese engines, while efficient, lacked the durability and reliability of American designs. Overheating, vibration, and inconsistent manufacturing quality were constant problems. These weaknesses were manageable in fighters. In heavy bombers, they were fatal. Despite these limitations, Japanese military doctrine pushed forward. The Imperial Japanese Army Air Force and Navy Air Service both believed that range could compensate for weakness. They envisioned bombers that could fly farther than any enemy aircraft, avoiding interception altogether. This belief shaped Japanese bomber development throughout the 1930s. Armor was minimized, defensive guns were reduced, structural weight was shaved wherever possible. The result was aircraft that looked impressive on paper but existed on the edge of structural failure. This philosophy worked temporarily against poorly defended targets, but it left no margin for error. At the same time, Japan watched foreign powers leap ahead. The United States introduced multi-engine bombers designed from the ground up for combat. The Boeing B-17, first flown in 1935, shocked observers with its size, defensive firepower, and ability to absorb damage. Britain, facing its own existential threats, invested heavily in bomber development. Germany, though focused on tactical bombing, fielded advanced medium bombers with high speed and payload. Japan, by comparison, was experimenting rather than mastering. It lacked a true heavy bomber program with industrial depth behind it. This gap created anxiety within Japanese military leadership. Engineers warned that developing a heavy bomber would take years Japan did not have. War in China was consuming fuel, aircraft, and pilots. Tensions with the United States were escalating due to Japan's expansionist policies. Oil embargoes and diplomatic pressure loomed. Every strategic forecast pointed toward a future confrontation with an industrial giant Japan could not outproduce. In that environment, speed became more important than perfection. The goal was not to build the best bomber, it was to build something that could fly far, carry bombs, and exist now. It was at this moment that opportunity appeared in an unexpected form. An American aircraft manufacturer had developed a civilian airliner intended for long-distance commercial travel. The aircraft promised efficiency and range, but airlines showed little interest. It could not compete with more successful designs. From America's perspective, it was a commercial disappointment. From Japan's perspective, it looked like a solution waiting to be seized. The aircraft already existed, the design was proven in civilian testing, and most importantly, it could be acquired legally, quietly, and quickly before relations with the United States deteriorated further. Japan's decision to purchase the aircraft was not illegal at the time. Pre-war arms restrictions focused on weapons, not civilian airframes. Japanese buyers presented themselves as commercial interests, not military agents. On paper, the transaction was mundane. In reality, it was strategic. Japan was buying time. Or at least, it believed it was. The assumption was simple. If the airframe could fly long distances with passengers, it could fly long distances with bombs. What that assumption ignored was stress. Passengers do not impose dynamic loads. Bombers do. Passengers do not require defensive gun mounts. Bombers do. Passengers do not force aircraft to fly through turbulence at combat altitudes under fire. Bombers must. Once the aircraft arrived in Japan, engineers immediately began military conversion studies. These studies revealed uncomfortable truths. The fuselage was not designed for large internal payloads. The wing spars were marginal for additional weight. The landing gear was insufficient for overloaded takeoffs. Engineers proposed reinforcements, but reinforcements meant weight. Weight meant reduced range. Reduced range undermined the very reason the aircraft had been purchased. The design was trapped in a contradiction it could not escape: improve survivability and lose range, preserve range and sacrifice safety. Military leadership chose range. Again, the same philosophy that had shaped earlier Japanese bombers was applied once more.
The aircraft would be lightly defended, structural reinforcement would be minimal, crews would rely on altitude, distance, and hope. It was a gamble, but Japan had made it many times before. What made this gamble different was scale. This was not a small experiment. This aircraft was meant to anchor Japan's long-range bombing capability. Factories began preparations, training programs were outlined, doctrine was written. The decision was no longer theoretical, it was locked in. By the time war clouds fully gathered, Japan had committed itself to a bomber that embodied its deepest strategic anxieties. It was a machine born from fear of falling behind and hope that distance could compensate for weakness. The background to this decision is not incompetence, but urgency, not ignorance, but overconfidence in adaptation. Japan believed it could bend a civilian design into a military role through willpower alone. History would soon prove how unforgiving physics, industry, and war truly are.
The moment Japan decided to transform the American airliner into a heavy bomber, the project stopped being an experiment and became a test of survival. What followed was not a single dramatic failure, but a slow, grinding realization that the aircraft was fighting its own nature at every stage of its existence. Engineers quickly discovered that the airframe resisted militarization. Every added component, bomb racks, gun mounts, additional fuel tanks, shifted the aircraft further away from its original balance. What had once been a relatively stable civilian transport now behaved like an overstressed machine constantly on the verge of rebellion. Test flights revealed alarming vibrations at high power settings, uneven lift under load, and a worrying tendency to lose control authority during extended climbs. These were not minor issues, they were warnings, but warnings are easy to ignore when time feels like an enemy. As production aircraft began to roll out, the gap between expectation and reality widened. On paper, the bomber could reach distances that excited planners. In the air, that promise came with conditions. Takeoffs required long runways and perfect weather. Fully loaded aircraft struggled to climb, often remaining vulnerable at low altitude far longer than planned. Pilots learned quickly that engine management was critical. Pushing the engines too hard risked overheating and failure, while being too cautious could result in an inability to gain altitude at all. Missions became exercises in compromise, where every decision carried hidden consequences. Crews joked darkly that the aircraft flew best when empty, a grim observation for a bomber whose purpose depended entirely on carrying weight. Training revealed even deeper problems. New pilots transitioning to the aircraft found it unforgiving. Control responses were sluggish under load, yet sudden stalls could occur with little warning. Recovery required altitude that missions often did not allow. Landing the bomber was equally hazardous. The undercarriage, designed for lighter civilian loads, absorbed punishment poorly. Hard landings damaged airframes, forcing aircraft out of service for extended repairs. Maintenance crews were overwhelmed, spare parts wore out faster than expected, and replacements were not always available. The aircraft demanded care that Japan's strained logistics struggled to provide. When the bomber finally entered operational service, reality struck with brutal clarity. Long-range missions exposed weaknesses no test flight could fully replicate. Navigation over vast stretches of ocean proved difficult, and minor course errors translated into massive fuel losses. Crews reported that headwinds could turn safe margins into desperate calculations. Fuel gauges were unreliable, engine performance varied between aircraft. Some missions ended with bombers ditching at sea, not because they were shot down, but because they simply could not make it home. Each loss quietly eroded confidence. Combat conditions amplified every flaw. The bomber's speed was insufficient to outrun enemy fighters, and its defensive armament was inadequate to deter them. Once intercepted, escape options were limited. The aircraft could not dive aggressively without risking structural failure, nor could it climb quickly to safety. Its large size made it an easy target, while its lack of armor meant that even light damage could be catastrophic. Crews described feeling exposed, as if the aircraft offered no protection beyond thin metal skin. Missions that should have demonstrated power instead revealed vulnerability. What made the situation worse was that losses did not always occur dramatically. There were no famous last stands or heroic dogfights to rally morale. Instead, there were incomplete mission reports, missing aircraft, and unanswered radio calls. Bombers vanished during long overwater flights, leaving behind only questions. Maintenance logs grew thicker with unresolved issues. Pilots returning from missions spoke cautiously, aware that criticism could be interpreted as weakness. Official reports emphasized effort and bravery, but between the lines, the truth was clear. The aircraft was not performing as intended. Strategically, the bomber failed to deliver meaningful results. Payload limitations reduced its impact on hardened targets. Accuracy suffered due to unstable flight characteristics. Missions often required fighter escort, undermining the supposed advantage of range. Commanders began to realize that the aircraft consumed more resources than it justified. Fuel, spare parts, trained crews, all were being invested into a platform that delivered diminishing returns. In a war defined by industrial output, inefficiency was a silent killer. Japan could not afford waste, yet this bomber embodied it. Morale among aircrews deteriorated. Pilots understood risk, but they also understood when risk was unnecessary. Flying a machine that felt structurally compromised created a constant psychological burden. Every vibration raised suspicion. Every unusual sound suggested impending failure. Crews trusted their training, but trust in the aircraft itself was fragile. Veterans began warning newcomers quietly, sharing tips to survive missions rather than how to succeed in them. This was not the mindset of an offensive weapon, it was the mindset of survival. As the war expanded, the bomber's shortcomings became impossible to hide. Newer enemy fighters entered service, faster and heavily armed. Anti-aircraft defenses improved. The bomber, already outdated at its introduction, now belonged to another era entirely. Yet, Japan continued to field it, partly out of necessity and partly out of denial. Replacing it would require admitting failure, and failure was politically dangerous. Instead, the aircraft was reassigned, reclassified, and reinterpreted. It was used for secondary roles, transport missions, reconnaissance, anything to justify its existence, but its identity as a heavy bomber had effectively collapsed. The core drama of this aircraft story is not a single battle, but a pattern of pushing a machine beyond its limits because there was no alternative, a pattern of crews adapting to flaws rather than eliminating them, a pattern of leadership hoping that persistence could compensate for design. This bomber did not fail in one catastrophic moment. It failed gradually, mission by mission, decision by decision, and by the time its true nature was fully understood, Japan was already too deep into war to change course. In the end, the aircraft became a symbol of misplaced faith, faith that conversion could replace innovation, faith that range alone could overcome vulnerability, faith that war would be forgiving. It was not. The bomber's operational history exposed the cost of rushing solutions under pressure. It showed that combat does not reward improvisation built on weak foundations, and it set the stage for a reckoning, one that would come not from enemy fire, but from an unavoidable truth Japan could no longer ignore.
The real failure of Japan's bomber did not arrive in a single catastrophic mission or a dramatic explosion over enemy territory. Instead, it revealed itself slowly, almost invisibly, through patterns that only became obvious when it was already too late to reverse them. Aircraft returned from missions with no damage, yet crews were shaken. Maintenance logs grew thicker, not because of battle scars, but because of internal fatigue and mechanical strain. Commanders noticed that missions planned with confidence were now planned with caution. The bomber was still flying, still listed on operational rosters, still counted as a strategic asset, but something fundamental had shifted. The aircraft no longer inspired belief, it inspired management. And in war, managing a weapon instead of trusting it is the first sign that something has gone deeply wrong. At higher levels of command, this change was difficult to admit openly. The bomber had absorbed years of planning, funding, and political capital. Canceling it would mean acknowledging that Japan's attempt to shortcut heavy bomber development had failed completely. In a culture where saving face mattered deeply, such an admission was unthinkable. Instead, leadership reframed the narrative. The bomber was not flawed, it was simply misaligned with current conditions. Its missions were adjusted, not because the aircraft was incapable, but because circumstances had changed. This explanation preserved authority, but it did nothing to solve the underlying problem. The aircraft remained structurally fragile, underpowered, and increasingly obsolete. As the war intensified, the bomber's weaknesses became more costly. Allied air power improved rapidly, radar networks expanded, allowing early detection of incoming aircraft. Fighter coordination grew sharper, interception faster, and anti-aircraft fire more accurate. The bomber, already lacking speed and protection, was now exposed to an environment that punished every design compromise. Even missions that avoided major targets faced dangers simply by existing in contested airspace. Crews realized that survival depended not on the aircraft's capabilities, but on luck and enemy error. This realization was devastating to morale. A bomber crew that believes its aircraft can bring them home fights differently from one that hopes it might. Inside the cockpit, the experience was mentally exhausting. Pilots flew with constant awareness of limits they could not exceed. Engines could not be pushed too hard without risking failure. Maneuvers had to be gentle to avoid overstressing the airframe. Even turbulence became a threat. Long-range missions turned into endurance trials, where concentration could never relax. Every unusual vibration raised fear. Every engine fluctuation felt like a countdown. The bomber demanded absolute attention at all times, offering no forgiveness in return. This psychological burden accumulated mission after mission, wearing down crews long before physical fatigue set in. Maintenance crews faced a different nightmare. The aircraft consumed time and effort far beyond expectations. Components wore out prematurely. Structural inspections revealed cracks and stress marks that should not have appeared so early in the aircraft's service life. Engines required frequent overhauls. Spare parts were scarce, forcing improvisation and cannibalization of grounded aircraft. Each bomber kept flying represented the sacrifice of another. In an industrial system already stretched thin, this inefficiency was devastating. The bomber was no longer just a weak weapon, it was a drain on Japan's ability to support more effective ones. The unexpected twist came when comparisons with Allied aircraft became unavoidable. Intelligence reports, pilot observations, and even captured materials painted a stark picture. Allied bombers were designed around survivability. They could take damage and keep flying. They had redundant systems, armored crew positions, and powerful engines capable of lifting heavy loads reliably. Japan's bomber, by contrast, had been designed around hope that range would prevent interception, hope that light weight would compensate for weakness, hope that crews would adapt. These hopes collapsed when faced with an enemy that had built aircraft for prolonged, brutal combat. The contrast was humiliating, but more importantly, it was irreversible. This realization triggered a silent doctrinal crisis. Japanese air doctrine had emphasized offensive reach and spirit over material resilience. The bomber was meant to validate that philosophy. Instead, it exposed its limits. Commanders found themselves issuing contradictory orders: push deep into enemy territory, but avoid defended areas; maintain offensive pressure, but minimize losses; use the bomber's range, but not its full payload. These contradictions confused crews and planners alike. Doctrine lost coherence, and when doctrine collapses, execution follows. The bomber sat at the center of this collapse, a physical manifestation of unresolved strategic tension. As months passed, the bomber's role diminished further. Officially, it remained part of the force. Unofficially, it was sidelined whenever possible. Newer aircraft, even if imperfect, were preferred. Older, more reliable platforms were trusted more in specific roles. The bomber was reassigned repeatedly: transport duties, secondary bombing missions, reconnaissance flights, anything that reduced exposure while preserving appearances. Each reassignment was framed as adaptation, but in truth it was retreat. The aircraft's identity as a heavy bomber had effectively died, even if the designation remained on paper. The most tragic aspect of this twist is that by the time the truth was widely understood, it no longer mattered. Japan's strategic situation had deteriorated beyond recovery. Resources were scarce, time was gone. Even if a better bomber design had existed, there was no capacity left to produce it in meaningful numbers. The decision to buy and adapt a rejected American airliner had not just failed, it had consumed the opportunity to do something better. Years that could have been spent learning, iterating, and building experience were lost. War does not refund wasted time. For the crews who flew the bomber, its legacy was deeply personal. They knew they were operating a machine that should never have been asked to do what it was doing. They adapted, survived when possible, and followed orders because that is what soldiers do. But belief, the kind that turns machines into weapons, was gone. The bomber was no longer trusted as a partner in war. It was endured, and endurance is not victory. The unexpected turn of this story, then, is not that the bomber failed, but how it failed. It failed quietly, persistently, and completely. It revealed that imitation without understanding is not innovation, that urgency cannot replace foundation, and that in war, decisions made to save time often cost far more of it in the end. The bomber did not explode into legend or infamy, it simply faded, leaving behind a lesson written in stress fractures, empty fuel tanks, and unanswered mission reports. And that lesson would haunt Japan far longer than the aircraft itself.
By the final years of the war, Japan's heavy bomber program no longer failed loudly. It failed quietly, almost invisibly, buried under larger disasters unfolding across the Pacific. Cities burned, supply lines collapsed, airfields disappeared under relentless bombardment. In that chaos, the rejected American airliner-turned-bomber slipped into obscurity, its story unfinished not because it lacked drama, but because the war had grown too brutal to notice one more broken promise. And yet, in that silence, the bomber's legacy became clearer than ever. It was no longer a weapon, it was evidence. Evidence of a decision made too fast, a shortcut taken under pressure, and a belief that adaptation could replace foundation. The aircraft's final missions reflected this reality. It no longer flew as the centerpiece of strategy. Instead, it was used where losses were expected, where risk outweighed reward, and where command quietly accepted that aircraft and crew might not return. This unspoken resignation defined its last chapter. Crews were briefed with fewer words, objectives were simplified, survival was no longer assumed. The bomber's range, once celebrated as revolutionary, now only meant longer exposure to enemy fighters and radar. Every extra mile was another opportunity for interception. What had been designed as an advantage became a liability. For the men inside the aircraft, the emotional toll reached its peak. They knew the war was turning, they knew the enemy's strength had surpassed their own, and they knew, deep down, that their aircraft represented a failed idea. Yet they flew anyway, not because they believed in victory, but because duty demanded motion even when purpose was gone. These final crews carried more than bombs. They carried the weight of decisions made years before they ever entered the cockpit, decisions they had no power to change. When the war ended, there was no ceremony for this bomber, no victory parades, no speeches praising its contribution. It was dismantled, scrapped, or abandoned where it stood. In post-war assessments, it appeared only briefly, mentioned in technical summaries and internal critiques. Analysts noted its limitations in dry language: insufficient defensive armament, structural fragility, engine strain, doctrinal mismatch. What those reports could not capture was the human cost of forcing an idea to work when it never truly could. History would later judge the bomber harshly. It earned a reputation as one of the least effective heavy bombers of the Second World War, but that label alone misses the deeper truth. The aircraft was not merely bad, it was misunderstood. It was asked to perform a role its origins had never prepared it for. Born as a civilian airliner, rejected by its creator, and repurposed under wartime desperation, it carried compromises in every rivet. Japan did not fail because it copied an American design, it failed because it copied the surface, not the soul. Slow pan across blueprints, fading into combat footage. This is where the story becomes bigger than one aircraft. The bomber stands as a warning written in aluminum and fire. Technology does not forgive impatience. You cannot skip experience. You cannot compress decades of doctrine into a single purchase. The United States and other allied nations had built their bombers through long cycles of testing, failure, and iteration. Japan tried to leap across that gap in one move. The result was an aircraft that looked impressive on paper, but collapsed under real-world pressure. War exposes truth faster than any engineer ever could. Yet, even in failure, the bomber left behind lessons. Post-war Japanese engineers studied its flaws carefully. They documented stress patterns, performance gaps, and doctrinal mismatches. These lessons quietly shaped Japan's post-war aviation philosophy, one built not on shortcuts, but on precision, reliability, and incremental improvement. In an ironic twist, the worst bomber in Japan's wartime history helped prevent future failures. Its legacy did not live in museums or memorials, but in caution. The emotional weight of this realization lingers because the tragedy was never inevitable. With different choices, different priorities, and more time, Japan might have built a bomber worthy of its ambitions. Instead, urgency replaced patience, pride replaced humility, and an aircraft meant to project power became a symbol of overreach. This is not a story of incompetence, it is a story of pressure, of leaders forced to act before they were ready, and of systems that punished delay more harshly than mistakes. As viewers, it is easy to judge from a distance, but history asks a harder question. What would we have done differently, knowing only what they knew at the time? In the early 1930s, buying an advanced American airliner seemed smart, efficient, modern. It promised to save years of development. No one could fully predict how fast air combat would evolve, how brutal the skies would become, and how unforgiving wartime reality would be. And yet, that is the burden of decision-making in war. You do not get perfect information. You only get consequences. The bomber's story doesn't end with scrap metal and footnotes. It echoes in every modern defense project rushed to meet a deadline, in every system deployed before it's ready, in every belief that adaptation can replace preparation. The skies of World War II were ruthless teachers, and they graded harshly. Japan's rejected bomber failed the test, not because it lacked courage or effort, but because it was never given the chance to become what it was supposed to be. And here lies the final punch. This aircraft was not defeated by enemy fighters alone. It was defeated long before it ever met them, defeated by assumptions, by haste, by the belief that copying success was the same as understanding it. The true enemy was not American guns or radar, it was time, and Japan ran out of it. But the story doesn't stop here, because this bomber was only one example. Japan made other desperate experiments. So did America. So did Germany. Some failed quietly, others changed history forever. We will look at another machine born from urgency, one that should have failed but didn't, an aircraft written off by experts, underestimated by enemies, and flown by men who refused to accept its limits.